Today is Friday, May 13th, and I am with Melodie Jones, who is director of Westfield Parks and Recreation. To begin with, Melodie, when and how did you begin in getting involved with trails?
Wow. Let's see. It goes back, I guess, in the 90s, knowing Alan Burnell, who is kind of the granddaddy of trails and Westfield resident. We first started seeing Monon t-shirts at public events around our community and knew that Carmel was fighting the battle to get the Monon north. And we started talking to other groups and found out that there was an awful lot of interest in not only the Monon Trail, but the Midland Trace Trail. And I got involved with the Friends of the Midland Trace and went to a few events for the Monon Trail supporters in Carmel. And next thing you know, we're all starting to work on rails to trails conversions. It just seemed like a natural progression that if you really want to preserve and make sure your community stays green, that these wonderful opportunities of linear parks needed to be preserved.
So what happened to get some teeth? What was sort of the first bite after this advocacy and parades? What was the first involvement that you and or Westfield had in getting the definition of the Monon right in Westfield?
Well, I think the big thing was when I was actually with the township, Washington Township in Hamilton County, as the parks director. Carmel already had the trail under, it was complete actually, I think by then. And we entered into an agreement to do the master plan for not only the Monon, but for the Midland. And that was the first official action I think Westfield, or actually it wasn't Westfield, it was Washington Township, took to make both the Monon and the Midland put it on the radar screen. We now had a master plan. Part of the reasoning for that was we knew that NDOT was going to be, and this was way back. This was before, well, let's see, it was probably 2002 when we first started these conversations. The master plan was actually finished in the spring of '04. But we knew that NDOT was going to be upgrading US 31. And in Westfield, US 31 is almost like the Great Wall of China. It divides our community from the east side and the west side. There's no good way for a pedestrian or a bicycler to be able to circulate our community because 31 is this physical barrier, an unsafe physical barrier. And in our early conversations with NDOT, it was always like, well, if you have a trails plan and we get to the point where we're actually designing what this freeway is going to look like, we have to consider your project. So I was so insistent that we get a plan in the books because, you know, even way back then, they kept saying it was going to happen. We're getting this freeway. So we moved ahead with that. And the township partnered with what was then the town of Westfield to pay for the plan. And Butler, Fairman, and Seifert helped us do it. And we got the plan put in place. Then we started applying for transportation enhancement grants to get the trail started. So along with the 2004 master plan, we also applied for our first T grant and was awarded that $1 million to get the first mile, which was from 146th Street to 156th Street. And it took 5 long years before that project was actually completed. We didn't open that first mile until the June of 2009.
Can you explain a transportation enhancement grant?
Yes, it is funding by federal highways that is funneled through INDOT, or Indiana Department of Transportation in Indiana. And you go through the process of applying for this grant and you're reviewed. Our area happens to be part of the Indianapolis Metropolitan Planning Organization. So the MPO, if you will, reviews our projects because we're within their jurisdiction. But ultimately, it is governed by NDOT, and we have to, you apply for the grant, and you have to then adhere to federal highway standards for not only building the trail, but also for the process. With our first grant, we went ahead and did the environmental study for the entire Monon corridor, which in our jurisdiction starts at 146th Street but goes all the way up to 216th Street. It was really important for us to go ahead and do the environmental study with the first phase, so that as we come back year after year and apply again for more federal funding, we don't have to, that's a part of the process that can really slow the process down. So now that we have that done, it does allow us to move forward with construction in the other areas more effectively. And then we took it to the next level and actually created a section in our thoroughfare plan that is addressed as the alternative transportation plan. So this document, when we did the master plan for the Monon and Midland, we took it to the next level, not only calling out the Monon and the Midland, but all the other designated areas that we wanted to make sure we're preserving and setting aside, which is what we call Cool Creek Trail, the Anna Kendall Creek Trail, Natalie Wheeler Trail, Grand Junction Trail, Little Eagle Creek Trail, and then the Monon Midland Loop. And that's all been called out and identified in a section of our thoroughfare plan that's called the Alternative Transportation Plan.
You have mentioned the Midland Trace. How do you describe that corridor? That's much more lost, shall we say, than the Monon.
Yeah, it is. Again, it was a railroad. It was known, it's had several names. Central Indiana Railroad. Here in Westfield, it was called the Midland, and it really was two separate words, Midland. And so when you look at our logo and it says Central and then it says Midland Trace Trail, so it's kind of taken both of those names and kind of rolling it in, but it is known as the Midland Trace Trail. That rail corridor ran from Anderson, Indiana to Lebanon, Indiana.
Do you know the dates when the Midland began or when the Midland ended service?
I don't know the original date when they started. I want to say it was somewhere in the 1860s, but I don't remember the actual date. We have where it is presently installed in our downtown. It came through, and we have what is now called Old Friends Cemetery Park, but it was the original Quaker cemetery in our downtown that, because the railroad came through, they actually relocated some people and started another cemetery much further south. And as a result of that, that cemetery really stopped being a cemetery at that point in time. The last person that was buried there was in 1889, but it was believed that they really stopped doing it at any main level at about in the late 1860s. So I think that's about when the railroad hit. Trains still came through here, I think, in the 1960s, so it ran for about 100 years. Natalie Wheeler Trail goes from Cool Creek Park, which is northern boundary, I guess you'd say about 156th Street, but the entrance is off 151st Street. So you come out of the park and you hit the Natalie Wheeler Trail, and it will run all the way up to 171st Street. At that point, it changes in character and actually becomes the Grand Junction Trail, leading into our designated area for downtown that we're calling the Grand Junction. It's a little more upscale, a little more urban at that point in time, and has a little different feel with the amenities along the streetscape that border the trail itself.
Yeah, but to have 2 miles or 3 miles of continuous trail and with the downtown on one side, at one end, and Cool Creek Park at the other is certainly interesting. Well,
and it's really exciting because we have a new road under construction that's on the south side of Cool Creek Park. We're calling it the East Side Access Road, which is, it's got to get named something. But with that project, that will also include trail. And when that is done later this summer, you can leave from Asa Bales Park, which is at 181st Street, on trail, and go all the way down to 10th Street on the Monon Trail without leaving a trail corridor.
Oh, wow.
So that includes the trail through Asa Bales Park, the Grand Junction Trail, the Natalie Wheeler Trail, then picking up Cool Creek Trail, which will take you to 146th Street, then get on the Hagenberg Trail, which is in Carmel, which links to the Monon, and then you're all the way to downtown.
That is...
pretty cool.
That's really neat.
And then with the completion of our section of the Monon that we're doing on the west side of 31, you'll be able to pick up just south of State Road 32, which, if it had a number, it would probably be 176 or something like that. I don't know what its, street name would be if it was a street versus a state highway, and take the Monon all the way down as well, continuous.
Where they crossed, and this part of the conversation goes back to the Monon, but where they crossed is in the area that US 31 is going to be torn up.
That's correct.
So obviously the Monon right-of-way and the Midland are going to be torn up at that place. Where's that crossing going to? How are you going to cross the two?
Well, actually, we have a designation in our trail system that is called the Monon Midland Loop. And as I mentioned before, 31 could have potentially made it impossible to have connectivity. But we are very, very fortunate that we have the mayor that we have, who has the connections with NDOT that he has, and his persuasiveness that has allowed us to move forward and get commitments from NDOT that with the 31 project in Hamilton County, we are going to have trail connections along Cool Creek Trail to the south, along the Anna Kendall Creek and 169th Street, as well as 181st Street, as well as Cool Creek to the north. Those are all designated 12-foot wide trail connections that are part of our Monon Midland Loop. At every other interchange, we will have sidewalks. So even though they're not 12-foot wide, we will still have pedestrian capacity to get over the freeway, if you will, by having sidewalks. This is huge. It's just incredibly huge to really be able to have the trail circulation, not only in our own community, but with the communities to our east and to our west and north and south.
That really is forward-looking because a state highway, let alone an interstate,
federal highway
or an interstate-sized highway can truly be a blockade to urban growth.
Yeah. So we are really excited, and it's the plan's in place, and these are all areas that we've gotten commitments from them, and some of them, as I mentioned, were creeks, which means instead of being up along the road, we're going to get where they rebuild the
culvert?
Culverts, thank you. When they rebuild the culvert, which they'll have to do to accommodate all the additional weight that this expanded freeway is going to create, we're getting trail connection right alongside. So, we are also getting connections along the streets, but just from the aesthetic and the feel of the trail, to have it within the wooded areas right along the creek is such a much nicer appeal than, we still want the 12-foot along 169th Street and 181st, but it is 12 feet right along 169th Street and 181st Street. So to have it along the Anna Kendall on two different locations of Cool Creek, it'll be really, really, really nice experience.
All of those places is wonderful. What's been the most rewarding and what's been the most challenging of your building trails, the building trails phase?
I think the most frustrating part of building trails is funding. You get a transportation enhancement award, but it's years before you get to actually use it. Seems to me if you give the award, you ought to be able to just have the money. And just the way that mechanism works, it's an 80-20 match for construction, but it's deceiving because you really are paying for it up front and then you get reimbursed. So, it's like if you had the money, why do you need the grant? If you follow what I'm saying.
Yes.
I mean, you need the 80% to get the project done. We can come up with the 20, So that seems backwards to me, and I really wish, Federal Highways would think about that. But so that to me is the hardest part. And in our community, all of my capital projects are paid either through grant money or donation. And I have to say, Westfield as a community has been outstanding in giving land donations. Of the Monon project that we have outside of phase 1, because that was all done with acquisition. But phase 2 and phase 3, 85% of all that land has been given to us.
Oh, wow.
I think the most rewarding was the day that we had our grand opening of the first mile, and we commemorated the first mile in Westfield as, not only is it the Monon Trail, but it's also been known, it is now known as the Alan Burnell Mile. And to be able to recognize Alan for his contribution, not only to our community, but really paving the way, because he and the group that did the Carmel Monon made building trails in Indiana, especially along the Monon Trail. You know, they went through all the hurdles and the class action lawsuit and the whole thing. They fought the battles. And so by the time it got up there and it was time for us to build our first mile, you know, the neighbors were saying, where do I sign the line? Yeah, I'll sell you my property. And Alan was so instrumental in Indianapolis and in Carmel, and it was just wonderful to be able to honor him in that way. To name the mile.
And he put up a good fight. I admired his tenacity, even though we were on opposite sides of the fence.